Well, it is great to be with all of you today who are here in Troy, and I am especially honored to be invited into your home, those of you who are watching with us this morning online. Today, we are beginning a brand new series, and throughout the series, we are going to be talking about the subject of faith. Not faith as in what you believe, but rather what it actually means to believe. And if this is your first time with us, the way that we kind of think about and the way that we structure and organize our messages is we take a topic, we take a theme, we take an experience of life, we take a question that all of us have to confront at some point in life, and then we talk about that topic thematically for several weeks, which is actually, incidentally, also the way that many of the New Testament letters are organized as well. If you think about the letters of Peter and Paul and James and John. And today is the beginning of this series, which means that today is the introduction. And so if at the end of our time together this morning, if you kind of leave with more answers than you had when you came in, that's okay, because this is like the first chapter of a book. And throughout the course of this series, we're actually going to deal with several different questions. Questions like this right here. What is faith? I mean, really? What does it actually mean to say that I trust God? And why is it, why doesn't it, right? Why doesn't faith? Why doesn't it always work? These are things that all of us, whether we think of ourselves as followers of Jesus or not, all of us wonder about this from time to time. Because whether we realize it or not, whether it's intentional or not, the truth is all of us, right? All of us in our minds, we create some cause and effect relationships between what it is that we do and what it is that we expect that God's going to do. Now, if you grew up in church or you grew up going to church, then you obviously grew up being told that you can pray to God and you can ask God to do things and that God answers prayer, which He absolutely does. But you may have also been told that if you have enough faith, then God is going to more than likely say yes to that prayer also. Maybe you were even told that if you actually have enough faith, you can basically get God to do whatever it is that you want Him to do as long as you have enough faith to ask Him. Or maybe you grew up and you always heard people telling these amazing stories, I lost my job on Monday, and so I went home and I fasted and prayed, and I called all the people in my small group on Tuesday, and they all fasted and they all prayed with me. On Wednesday, the owner of the company called me and made me the president of the company. Right? And you're like, that's awesome, right? And I'm happy for you. But listen, I've been praying for a year, right? A year. Just to get a consistent job. Just to get something livable, right? Not rich, not fancy, not C-suite level, just a livable, consistent job. And now you've been praying for like a day and you're hanging out with Mary Barra and Elon Musk. And meanwhile, I'm still here struggling just to figure out how I'm going to make rent this month. And prayer is a part of it, and God is a part of it, and you have faith, right? At least you kind of think that you do. And you know that all these things kind of fit together somehow, but nothing's ever worked out for you like that. And so you sit there and you kind of wonder to yourself, okay, so what really is the difference between hoping that something's going to happen and being able to say, no, God, I'm actually trusting you to do this, right? And the longer you've been around church and the more church people you know, the more often you actually hear people say things like, no, God, I am trusting you for that. And so you wonder, okay, what exactly does that mean? And probably every once in a while you bump into somebody that has this incredible faith, right? And they're not weird. They don't paint rainbows and unicorns on everything. It's not that. But even in the midst of these crazy, like gut-wrenching, heartbreaking circumstances, they have faith. And they have peace. And you see that and you think to yourself, okay, I would actually like that, right? Whatever that is. And so for the next several weeks, we're going to talk about the subject of faith. And here's why this is so important. Because listen, everyone, right? Everyone has faith. Faith is not exclusively a Christian idea. In fact, the truth is, even atheists have faith. Because see, regardless of your background, regardless of how you were raised, if I were to call you up and say, hey, do you want to go get coffee sometime this week? If we were to sit down and have coffee together, and if I were to say to you, okay, tell me how you think the world works, right? You would respond by saying, well, I think, or well, I believe, right? See, that's faith. Because see, in your thinking, you have created some cause and effect relationships between what it is that you do and the way you think and the way you behave and the way that you approach life in this world and what you believe should happen on your benefit. And so you have, just like all of us, we all have some element of faith in our life. But what we're going to discover today and throughout the course of this series is that in every type of faith other than the type of faith that Jesus and the New Testament talk about, there is in fact something that is missing. And so to start us off together this morning, I want you to think about a question, and I just want you to think about this to yourself. Don't ask your neighbor, don't elbow anyone. I just want you to think about this and answer this in your own mind. And the question is simply this: what is your faith leaning against? Now, you may never have thought about it in these terms before, but the truth is, every single day you make decisions based on a belief system, and you may not even know what that belief system is. Maybe, I don't know, maybe today you'll actually kind of piece that together a little bit. But there is something that is actually propping up your current system of belief about how the world works. There is something that's propping up what you think about God and how God works and why God works and why sometimes he does and why sometimes he doesn't. And I'll admit that on the surface, this can seem like a little bit of a, up there, out there, who cares kind of a topic, until you realize that the answer to this question is also actually the answer to the question, what was the faith that you lost? What was that faith? What was that leaning up against? And so what I want to do for a couple of minutes today is I want to flip this around, and I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking to those of you who would say that you have lost faith or you have walked away from your faith, or maybe you feel like maybe you're in the process of losing your faith right now. Because a discussion about losing faith or abandoning faith is really the discussion that helps us to understand how important it is that we actually, how important it is that our faith is actually leaned up against, that it's propped up against the right thing to begin with. Because if you're a person who has walked away from their faith or abandoned their faith, then you kind of feel like your whole world is coming apart, right? You don't know what to say. You don't know how to pray. You don't know what you can actually expect from God anymore, right? You don't even know if there is a God anymore, and you find yourself questioning things that you never thought that you would ever question. And see, what happened to you was this, and you may not have realized it, but whatever it was that you were leaning your faith up against, that thing, it moved. And when your faith moves, it begins to fall, and eventually it fails. Now, from my experience as being a pastor and from talking to people for more than 30 years, from teenagers all the way up to people who are in their 70s and 80s, and whenever I hear someone tell me that they have lost faith or they have walked away from their faith, generally speaking, it is because of one of two or both of these two things right here. Either a pattern of behavior or an unexplainable event. Right? Patterns of behavior and unexplainable events actually do more to erode faith and chip away at faith than anything else that we experience or deal with in life. And so let me explain both of these a little bit here. Probably all of you at home, probably all of us were raised in a home or in an environment where we were told as we were growing up that cheating in school and lying and being dishonest and copying other people's homework and all that stuff, that was bad. Right, that being dishonest was wrong. And so probably you believe that, and even though you probably cheated on some homework assignments, and even though you probably copied some answers from tests at some point, you still believe that doing that was wrong because that's what you were raised to believe. Right? And when you were in middle school or high school or college, that was fine. But then you graduated and you got a job, right? And you got a job with a company or in an industry where cheating and being less than honest wasn't only normal, it was actually called a competitive advantage. And so now you have this dilemma that's kind of going on inside of you because you were raised to believe that what was happening and what this company was doing was actually wrong. But when you look around the office, it doesn't seem to be bothering anybody else. And so now you actually have a real problem. Because now you have basically two choices. Either you quit your job, right, or you feel guilty all the time. And since neither of these are particularly good choices, suddenly a third choice comes to mind, and you find yourself considering something that you never considered before, which is that maybe what I always believed, maybe that isn't actually true. And see, as you continue to live in that environment day in and day out, even though it's completely different than the environment you grew up in, slowly you actually begin to think differently. And over time, you begin to adapt to a different pattern of behavior, and that pattern of behavior actually impacts and affects what it is that you believe. And see, the truth is, this happens to us all the time, to some extent or another. Now, what slowly is happening is that we change the way that we behave, and so then we gradually change the way that we believe, as if we were saying that what we believed was wrong. But we're not changing our beliefs because we think what we believed is wrong. We're actually changing our belief because slowly we began behaving in a different way, and our new behavior actually impacted our belief, right? Over time, behavior impacts our belief, not because of research, but simply because of the people and the culture that we're surrounded with. And again, there are countless examples of this, and probably all of you can think of your own illustrations or situations where you've actually experienced this. Now, the other category, the other kind of big category, are the unexplainable events, right, that happen throughout the course of life. Because you grew up believing that God would never, and then God did anyway. Or somebody told you that God will always, but then it seemed like, at least for you, that God didn't. You grew up believing that if you do A, B, and C, then God will do D, E, and F. But you've been doing A, B, and C consistently, and God has not done D, E, or F. And so there are these unexplainable events in your life that just don't line up with your thinking about God. And so consequently, your faith begins to crumble. And again, this happens all the time. You're expecting God to show up on your behalf, right? You've prayed, you've waited for God to answer your prayer. God hasn't answered your prayer, right? You've done all the things that everybody has told you to do. In fact, the truth is, some of you are actually back in church right now because you're not sure how God works, but you're pretty sure that church is a part of it, right? And you don't even like church, right? But you're here and you're hoping that God's going to go, oh, look, she's in church. She gets a gold star. Whatever she asks for today, I'm going to say yes, right? You don't know how it works. You think you've got to earn God's favor. You think you've got to get in on God's good side. Right? In fact, the truth is, I would be willing to bet that all of us in this room watching right now, every single one of us either are somebody or knows somebody who would say, listen, my faith took a big hit when God did not do what I expected God to do because somebody told me that's what God was like. And now, I don't know what to believe. Patterns of behavior and unexplainable events are what erode faith faster than anything else, right? And here's what both of those things have in common. Both of those are what is called, or what can be called, circumstantial faith, right? Circumstantial faith. Circumstantial faith is my trusting in God and my believing in God based on my ability. This is key. My ability to actually find God in my circumstances. Now, to some extent, again, all of us have a degree or an element of circumstantial faith in our lives. That's absolutely normal. The problem, however, is that circumstantial faith is always fragile. Because, and I know this will be a great shock to all of you because you've never noticed this, but life in this world is not very consistent, is it? Right? There is a randomness to life, and so seemingly there is a randomness to God. Right? And every time you think you figured out the formula, right? Pray twice a day, read my Bible, go to church. right? That's the formula. Every time you think you figured out the formula and you ask God to do something, God doesn't do it, and then you think, okay, so what's wrong with me or what's wrong with God? And now, there's a bunch of reasons why circumstantial faith is so fragile. First, the truth is, we are not actually very good, okay, if we're honest. We're not actually very good at interpreting the events of life, right? Because we look at life in terms of a week, a month, right? Maybe even a year, and we think, okay, God, why didn't this happen? Or God, why did you allow this? And since, that job didn't work out, and since he never called me back, and since, my kid has not come home yet, that must mean that, God, that you don't love me. That's how it feels, right, when we try to interpret the events of life. The classic example would be, if you dropped in on me and my family while we were raising our kids, while Joe and Nathan were growing up, if you would have dropped in on just several different moments in our life and asked my kids, hey, do you think your dad loves you? There would be plenty of times I'd be willing to bet that they would look at me and say, no, he absolutely hates me. Why? Because he's taken me to the doctor and he's making me get a shot. Because he's taken me to the dentist and they're gonna fill one of my teeth because I've got a cavity. And see, as an adult, you hear that and you think, well, that's actually proof that your dad loves you. And your kids would say, but no, that's proof that my dad hates me. Because if he loved me, why in the world would he let somebody do something to me that's going to hurt me? Right? See, the truth is, we are not very good at interpreting all the experiences of life, probably for each of you, just like me. There is probably something in your past that you look back on, and at the time, you think this is just absolutely awful, like it could not be any worse than this. And then 10 years, 20 years, 30 years later, you look back on that and you say to yourself, you know what, I'm actually so glad and so thankful that happened. So was that a good event, or was that a bad event? Right? In the moment, it was a bad event, but ultimately, it was actually something good. But see, if you would have evaluated God's love for you in that moment, you would have been wrong. That's what happens when we try to understand or try to piece together our faith based on the various circumstances of life that we experience with. And I think all of us know this, but I think whenever you talk about a subject like this is so important to say and just be really explicit about. The truth is, there are some things that happen in life, right? Some things that we experience, some things that the people that we love experience. There are some things in life that we experience that absolutely have nothing to do with God whatsoever. Right? Things that are simply the result of the devil, our own sinful choices, other people's sinful choices, the sheer brokenness of our world, all kind of working together, right, to create pain and suffering in our lives. See, the truth is, Satan would actually love for each of us to believe that God is the cause of all those things. And if we're left to try to know God or understand God simply based, and what God is like, simply based on my ability to interpret the circumstances of my life, the truth is we're not actually going to get very far. Right? At best, we're going to end up being confused about what is from God and what isn't from God. And at worst, we're going to actually end up blaming God for the very things that he actually wants to save us from, which is the power of sin, the power of death, and the work of the devil in our lives and in our world. Now, the other part of this that kind of makes us just classically bad at interpreting the circumstances of our life is that so many times, if we're honest, our time frames just aren't long enough. Right? I mean, something happens on Monday, you give God Tuesday, but like on Thursday, something needs to be happening. Right? Or maybe you're gracious and you say, okay, God, I'm going to give you the weekend. Right, this is a big one, God, so I'm going to give you 2 weeks to get this one figured out. Right, this is so important. Please don't miss this. When we evaluate God's faithfulness, when we evaluate God's presence, when we actually evaluate God's willingness to intervene based on a time frame that's short enough to suit us, but not him, we always come to wrong conclusions about God. Always. One of the most fascinating stories in the Bible, some of you might actually remember this story, is also one of the longest stories about any one single individual. It's the story of Joseph found in the book of Genesis. And what's so fascinating about this story is when you read it, there's like a period of 12 to 15 years where God does absolutely nothing for Joseph. Now, if you read this story as an outsider, it's very evident that God is at work and that he's up to something. But if you put yourself in the story, right, if you're Joseph and you read the story from Joseph's perspective, there is no evidence at all that God is doing anything. And yet what's so fascinating about this story, and if you haven't read this lately, you should read this. Joseph was key to getting the nation of Israel into Egypt. Right? You read this and you discover that Joseph is actually trusting God, and he continues to believe in God, not based on his circumstance, but based on something else entirely different. And then finally, and maybe you can relate to this, the truth is we just don't interpret the voice of God very well. Now, depending on how you were raised or how familiar you are with church, that just might sound kind of strange to you, right? So I understand that if that's you. But for those of you who kind of grown up in church, you get this because you hear people say this all the time, that God spoke to me, or God said to me, or God showed me. And I absolutely believe that God still speaks to us in our world. I'm not speaking against that whatsoever. All I'm simply saying is this. If you are absolutely certain that God has spoken to you about something, and then God doesn't do what you think God should do or said that he would do, most of the time what ends up happening is we end up thinking to ourselves, okay, maybe I can't trust God anymore. When maybe, right? Maybe, isn't it possible? Isn't it possible that maybe we just misunderstood God? I mean, I misunderstand Autumn. She misunderstands me all the time. My kids misunderstand both of us, right? And I misunderstand them. And they're actually sitting right in front of me so many times, and I can talk to them, and I can clarify and ask questions and say, what do you mean? And I can watch their body language and tone and do all that stuff. I mean, isn't it possible that sometimes we just misunderstand what God is saying to us? See, I think the answer to that is absolutely yes. But listen, if your faith is based on your ability to always hear from God and get it right the first time, that's actually circumstantial faith. Because that's me trusting in God based on the context of my experience alone. Now, I'm going to say something, and some of you are going to think I'm like contradicting myself, but I'm not. So I'm going to try to be as clear as I possibly can. Many times, what we do discover is that God actually does use an event or a series of events or some circumstances in life to ignite or to reignite our faith. In fact, maybe this is part of your story, like it's part of my story. I was going through a very difficult time in life, and so I actually called out to God, like out loud, and said, God, where are you? Because I need you. Because, God, if you're real, I actually need you to show up right now. Maybe that's your story, right? Like it's my story. And something happened, right? And in that moment, God responds. And so you say, hey, that's when it became real for me, right? That event, it launched my faith. That event, that's where my faith, that reignited, right? Or it ignited for the first time. That started my faith. It was the beginning of my faith. But here's the point. This is so important. God will often use significant moments to launch faith, right? But those moments were never designed to actually be the foundation of faith. Those were never meant to be the thing that we actually lean our faith up against. Right? Because those moments come and those moments go. And sometimes God answers our prayers, and other times it seems like God is completely silent. Sometimes God works within our time frames. Other times it seems like God just absolutely ignores our time frame altogether. And see, all of these are examples of circumstantial faith. And see, this is why, as followers of Jesus, right, the foundation of our faith is never an experience. Experience might be the launching pad, right? But it's never the foundation. Instead, the foundation of our faith is actually found in something that the author of the book of Hebrews tells us about. Now, the book of Hebrews is a very interesting book because it was written to a group of followers of Jesus who were Jewish, and because they were Jewish and they did follow Jesus, life was actually very miserable for these people. They lost their jobs, they lost their place in society, they had no status in the community whatsoever. And in this particular situation, what's fascinating is somebody told this group of people that Jesus was coming back like soon, right? Like, don't bother mowing your lawn today when you get home because it's not going to matter, right? Like that kind of soon, right? But Jesus never said that. Jesus said, listen, I want you to go into the whole world and tell everybody about me, and then I'm going to come back, right? Which is actually a very good reminder for us and for our world today. And so for this group of people, when Jesus didn't come back as quick as they expected, they began to actually lose their faith and walk away from their faith. And so the author of Hebrews says to these followers of Jesus, listen, don't give up your faith. Right? He kind of pleads with them. Don't abandon your faith. Don't walk away from your faith just because of your circumstances. And in doing that, he gives to us this unmistakable foundation for what our faith should be. And he says this, he says, therefore, right? Therefore, since we have, notice present tense, right? Since we have this right now, he says, since we have this great high priest. Now, I want to pause here for just a moment, and I want to talk about this word right here, the word priest. Because if you were raised in a Catholic church, or if you grew up going to an Episcopal church like I did, then the person who did what I do on Sunday mornings was referred to as a priest. The reason we don't have priests in our church is because we actually believe that Jesus was the last priest. Right? That's what the author of Hebrews is saying to us, right? Jesus was the last. He was the great high priest. A priest is a person who represents people to God, right? That's what a priest does. And the New Testament, all through the New Testament, it teaches that Jesus was the great high priest. And so consequently, you and I, all of us, we actually have access to God directly because of Jesus. We don't need another priest, right? Because we already have the last. We have the great high priest who has, right? This is something that he's done. This great high priest he has gone through the heavens. And this is actually a summary statement, right? Summarizing all of Jesus' life and all of Jesus' ministry. What the author of Hebrews is saying, listen, since we have, like right now, this high priest who actually came to earth, walked around, performed miracles, and who claimed to be the Son of God, and then substantiated that claim not only by his life and his miracles, but also because he physically, literally rose from the dead. And then he went to be with God the Father in heaven. Since we right now have that, a high priest who's done all of that, he says, who is Jesus Christ, right? He says, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, let us hold firmly, as in right now, to the faith. Hold firmly to the faith that we profess. Right? In other words, here's what he's saying. He's saying, listen, I know that you're struggling right now. I know that you live in a world that's just absolutely hostile to so much of what you believe. I know it feels like God isn't listening to your prayers. I know your family is suffering. I know you personally are hurting. I know you're battling illness. I know the pain and the questions that come with that. But don't quit believing. Why? Because listen to what you have. Because you have, right, Jesus who showed up. He actually walked this earth as one of us. He was seen. He was touched. He loved other people. He spoke to other people. He performed miracles that were substantiated by hundreds and thousands of people. He died on a cross, and then he literally was raised back from the dead. And he appeared physically to more than 500 people at the very same time. That's what we have right now. That's why you don't give up believing. Because the foundation of our faith is not an experience. The foundation of our faith, it isn't even an answer to our deepest prayer. The foundation of our faith is a person. It is the person of Jesus who is. He is the Christ. And see, listen, the reason we believe when things are good and the reason we believe when things are bad is not because things are good or things are bad. It's not because we can make sense out of every circumstance that life throws our way. The reason we believe is because 2,000 years ago, something happened. The foundation of our faith is something that happened in our history and not in our ability to figure out and interpret all the circumstances of our life right now. In fact, this is why every once in a while, again, you bump into somebody, right? And you talk to them, and you discover they have this amazing, extraordinary faith, even though their circumstances are absolutely horrible. Right? And if you're honest, you talk to them and you think to yourself and you wonder how in the world can this person continue to believe with the situation that they're in? Right? How in the world can they continue to believe when things clearly, it is obvious, things did not work out for this person? How in the world can they continue to believe? With all that they're going through, with all that their family is going through. I mean, you're looking at their circumstances and saying, how can they have that much faith? But the reason they have faith in the midst of their circumstances is because they don't have circumstantial faith. They actually have real faith. And if you ask them for the reason for the faith that they have, I'm telling you, they will give you a reason. And that reason, it will be Jesus. Because Jesus is the foundation of our faith. The foundation of our faith is a person. The foundation of our faith is something that actually happened in our history and not in our lifetime. But see, the truth is, I'm just like you. And I love to hear about all the amazing answers to prayer and the times that God works miraculously and incredibly in a single moment. Right? And I've heard those stories so many times, and I believe all of them. Please hear me. I'm not saying I absolutely believe all of that, right? I got fired on Monday, I prayed on Tuesday, and then on Wednesday the owner called and made me the president of the company, right? We're getting ready for surgery. The doctor said it was hopeless. They did a scan, and they found out it was completely gone. And that was 10 years ago, and we've been fine ever since. I've heard all those stories, and I believe all that. And I think all of that is great. But I'm telling you, that is not the foundation. In fact, those are not the things that actually stop me in my tracks as a follower of Jesus. The thing that stops me in my tracks as a follower of Jesus is the person, right, who devotes their life to a company, and they give that company the best years of their life. They give them every time, every hour, all that they have to bring. And then that company decides, you know what, we're done with you. And they slander that individual, and they throw them out. And that individual decides, you know what, I'm going to actually trust God that he's up to something in this. That's what stops me in my tracks. It's the family that I stand next to at the graveside. And I'm standing next to a husband or a wife or a brother or a sister or a father or a mother. And God clearly did not answer the prayer. And they never recovered from the accident. And they lost that battle with the disease. And even though their circumstance and their situation right now is absolutely horrible, the situation is horrible, they still can say, listen, my Heavenly Father is good. This situation is horrible, but I still trust God as my Heavenly Father. Why wouldn't I? The whole reason he sent his son into this world is so that death wouldn't be the end, so that I would know that I am going to see my loved ones again. See, that's where I find my hope. That's why I continue to be faithful. That's why I continue to trust him. That's why I continue to be dependent on him. That's the foundation of my faith. See, right now, the truth is, your faith is leaning up against something, and I am telling you, if it is circumstantial, you need to know. Because eventually, it will fall, and eventually fail. But see, here's the amazing thing, and I'm telling you, this is how much your Heavenly Father loves you. Your heavenly Father is not asking you to trust him based on your ability to figure him out, or to trust him based on your ability to find him in the circumstances of your life right now. Instead, he says, listen, I'm asking you to trust me with all of your circumstances and with everything that you experience in this life, because listen, I sent my son into this world to face the very same situations that you're facing and deal with the very same situations that you're dealing with because I love you. But I don't want you to think that I love you because I answer your prayers. It's way, way bigger than that. I love you because I sent my son to die for you. And that's what I want you to lean your faith up against, and what I want you to build your faith on. What it is that I have done for you. What no circumstance, what no event, and what no situation, what no experience can take away. And that's where we're going to pick it up next week. Now, before I pray for you today, I've got 3 questions that I would love for you to think about. Now, these questions are great for you to think about on your own, and you can answer these personally and on your own. They're even better to talk about or to discuss with a group of friends or in a small group. When people say they've lost faith or that they've walked away from faith, what does that actually mean? And have you ever lost your faith? In your experience, which of these 2 scenarios is more likely? Our behavior changes our beliefs, or our beliefs change our behavior? And then I want you to read Hebrews chapter 12, verses 2 and 3. If you don't have a Bible on your phone, you can download the YouVersion Bible. It's free. You can read this verse. I want you to read these 2 verses, and I want you to think about, how is faith that leans on Jesus just different, right? Just fundamentally different from faith that leans on what's going on around us right now. Let me pray for you. Heavenly Father, I want to pray very specifically right now for the person who's here, the person who's watching. And today brought up a lot more questions than it did answers for them. In fact, they realized that maybe they're not exactly sure what it is that they're placing their faith in. But what they do know is they are absolutely certain that they need something that isn't going to move, something that isn't going to slip away or be taken away. And so, Jesus, I pray for all of us today that we would be reminded that we can absolutely trust you. Not because we always understand what you're doing, not because we're always able to interpret our lives in this world correctly, but simply because 2,000 years ago, you demonstrated your love for us in an unmistakable way by taking our sin onto your shoulders and giving to us and offering to us a brand new way to approach, a brand new way to understand, and a brand new way to actually just live, to live our lives in this world. And so I would just ask Jesus that over these next several weeks, as we go through this series together, that we would be reminded over and over and over again that the foundation of our faith is found in you. It's found in your love for us and what it is that you have done for us. And so, Jesus, I